Dr. Edwards is an associate professor of history at the Arkansas State University, and he teaches a variety of classes on American history, Arkansas history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, early American Republic, and America in the 19th century. Dr. Edwards was also the Fulbright Fellow and a guest professor of history at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies in Berlin, Germany. He was a local humanities scholar for the National Endowment for Humanities outreach program, Making Sense of the Civil War. He has authored a dozen of articles and book chapters, and he has co-authored the book titled Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018. He's currently writing a book with the title Yeoman Families of Crockett's, Tennessee. I assume Crockett is a county in Tennessee? Oh, David Crockett, okay, excuse my. I'm a first-generation American. The title is Yeoman Families of Crockett's, Tennessee, Imagining Common Southerners, 1819-1865. Dr. Edwards, in his presentation, will contrast the historic realities of farming in two different contexts: a common yeoman family's farm and a cotton plantation in the Arkansas Delta that was surprisingly overseen by an enslaved black man called Reuben. And I will leave it to him to tell us the rest. Dr. Edwards?
Okay, thank you. It's always dangerous going after lunch, so I'll try to tell you the most engaging stories I can. I do find these two particular stories interesting. Maybe you find one more interesting than the other. And I talk about them with my students in class, which is where most of these come from. Well, exclusively it comes from. I use these in class as well. Okay, let's, well, I'll tell you about both of them as we go along, but I guess I want to go backwards. I want to start first with the yeoman farmer in the Ozarks who's free, and this is a man named William Swan. I do not have a picture of William and Eliza Swan, so this is a representative photograph of what William and Eliza Swan might have looked like. And also, too, perhaps the title, I should make sure we're clear. A lot of times my students, too, they don't have any idea what in the world a yeoman is. A yeoman is sort of a scholar's term that means an independent, small landholding farmer. It's an Old English term. It means sort of like a middling farmer. So the idea is that independent family farming, that's where the term comes from. Sometimes people find that term off-putting when they realize you just mean a common farmer, and that's essentially what we mean. The way we know about William and Eliza Swan is through a memoir called Life in the Leatherwoods by John Quincy Wolfe. Now, Life in the Leatherwoods is actually a delightful read. I assign it every so often in Arkansas history, and I've used it quite a few times over the years, and that's how I discovered about William and Eliza Swan. Life in the Leatherwoods, then, for the background, it's based on, here, this is an actual picture. The man on the right is John Quincy Wolfe Sr. So let me tell you a little bit about how we got Life in the Leatherwoods and where the Swans come from out of this. John Quincy Wolfe Sr. was born in 1864. He had an older sister, and they lived with their mother. They were orphaned quite young. His father died when he was 6. His mother died when he was around 11. He was born in and around Calico Rock area, and when he became orphaned once and finally, when his mother passed away, he moved a little bit further up into the woods there along the White River, which he called the Leatherwoods, named for a shrub, a shrubby plant known as the leatherwood, which is where the title comes from. So the title itself, Life in the Leatherwoods, indicates you're not even on the White River, you're even a little further up in the woods, kind of off the beaten path. The book itself, it is a fascinating compilation of memoirs that he sort of pieced together as an older man when he lived in Batesville in the early 20th century. John Quincy Wolfe Sr. had a son who went on to be a literature professor at Rhodes College in Memphis. And the son took his father's snippets that had been published in various newspapers over the last few years, and then he molded them together in a really interesting narrative. And like I said, I do assign it every so often to Arkansas history classes. It's suitable, I think, for middle school and even high school as well, if there's any teachers in the room that are looking for something else to use. The collection, the main part of the collection is at Lyon College, which is where most of Wolf's original papers are. But the book itself has been in print for a couple of decades. And like I said, I always tell students, usually, when I try to get them to encourage them to read it, of course I make them write about it and I test them, so then they kind of have to read it. But nevertheless, when I encourage them that it won't be as painful as they think it will be, I tell them that it's funny because it's written in the style of Mark Twain, which is true. I mean, if you like Mark Twain's humor, you would probably like Life in the Leatherwoods. It's sort of a homespun, kind of a simple humor. Unfortunately, oftentimes students ask me, who is Mark Twain? And then I have to do some background. But nevertheless, that's what it's like. And so that's how the book has come to us. So it's somewhat similar in a way, I suppose, if you're familiar with Little House on the Prairie. What we know about Little House on the Prairie is that Laura Ingalls Wilder created the stories, but her adult daughter really fashioned them together into a narrative that became the books. And there's some discussion among literary scholars as to who is the real author. And nevertheless, the Wolf narrative is somewhat like that. And so that's how we come to know them. John Quincy Wolf was raised by his aunt, Eliza, and Uncle William Swan, that he often called Uncle Swan. Now, in reading the narrative, what you get is really a classic example of life in the mid-19th century on an Ozark farm. And it's really very, very typical to what most Arkansas farmers, common farmers, would have had to process and get through from sort of day to day, week to week, season to season. So this is a slide actually pulled straight out of my Arkansas history course that I use very regularly when I talk about what was life like for regular folk. Because frankly, when I teach Arkansas history, it almost feels like agricultural history. I mean, it's kind of really the main prism I use to discuss much of Arkansas history is through the prism of agriculture. And so students find this pretty intuitive. It's the agricultural cycle, the 4 seasons. Even people who know nothing about farming at all, which includes most modern people know very little, the 4 seasons is pretty intuitive. And I won't go through every bit of it with you, but like this is what that you see when you read about the memoir in Life in the Leatherwoods. You see the various tasks done during certain seasons of the year. You have to do them. There's really no way to get around them. This is what a lot of people thought about farming, which made it so honest in the 19th century especially. They said, you can't really hoodwink the agricultural cycle. If you try to get somebody to sell you a mule, maybe you can sort of, pull back on some of the information. You can maybe be dishonest. A farmer can't really be dishonest with the 4 seasons. They are what they are. They set the cadence. You have to march to that beat. And so these are the things that people would do in and out of season. And John Quincy Wolf said that his Uncle Swan was really great at the agricultural calendar, but it was a small family-oriented farm. He didn't get too much. He didn't have too little. He had a way of sort of making things work. If one crop failed, another crop came in better later on. And so it all seemed to kind of balance out, right, one way or the other because of the diversification. And again, you can see various things here that might be a little bit peculiar. Lay-by season, I think the term has been used already in one of the presentations. Farmers still sometimes refer to this time they lay the crops by. They don't work in them regularly anymore. School and camp meetings are usually in the summertime. That is religious church camp meetings. When I first moved to Arkansas and I was studying about Hoxie, I couldn't figure it out why in the 1950s school started in Hoxie in July, and then I finally realized that's because they have to let it out again in September for cotton picking, right? And so some of these relics are still are held over later in the 20th century. Again, now students don't know anything about this kind of stuff at all. So again, like I said, the agricultural cycle is fairly intuitive, but the life of the swans really embodies that. And so it is an interesting way to really try to understand how does it really work. Because again, I mean, I know I'm banging this drum, but this is sort of the drum I beat on quite a bit. That is a world that is really lost to us. Right, if you go into Cracker Barrel, everybody understands all the stuff in Cracker Barrel is just festooned with all these agricultural implements, right? They're all over the walls. And you ask people, what is that? And they're like, I don't know, it's Cracker Barrel. Nobody really knows what it's supposed to be. But they all mean something. It's a bull-tongue plow, it's a double shovel plow, it's a butter churn. It's surprising how many people, my students, don't even know what a butter churn is for. Like, why are they messing with the butter? Just go to the store and buy butter. Why do you have to all these kinds. Or ask them what a spinning wheel is. That's a little discouraging too, to ask students to explain what a spinning wheel is or what it's for. But you just realize it is a world we have lost, right? To borrow a common phrase that historians like to use. And so you do get this sense of connection when you read Life in the Leatherwoods. So it is a really great description of the yeoman farm lifestyle. Now, the Swan family themselves, as remembered by John Quincy Wolfe, there's a few things that are very different from today. And then also there's some things that are very unique to them at that time. So here's some of the things that are different, and also by explaining them, I think I should sort of show some of the significance and some of the things we can learn about them in turn. One of the things is that it's not a surprise. Most people understand that 19th century Arkansas farmers produced a fair amount of their own food. Everybody intuitively understands this. What we don't always really understand is how do you do that, and at what level is it really possible? Nobody can produce all of their food. Everything that they consume in the 19th century. They have to buy sugar, they have to buy salt, they have to buy a few other little small things, right? So, and again, by this time, they're starting to buy more fabric and things like that. But still, on the Swan farm, they produce just about everything. They make peas, potatoes, corn. They have early corn. They have late corn. They were one of the few farms that had wheat that was raised. Most everybody ate cornbread all the time, even for breakfast back then. When you read Life in the Leatherwoods, he waxes eloquent about the fact that Uncle Swan was one of the few farmers who raised wheat, so they had their own biscuits. In fact, he writes so much about food that when you close the book, you want a biscuit, usually. It's kind of like that's how much he writes about food and the glories of biscuits in particular, which just seems to be his favorite food. Another thing is that the Swan family, and again, this is in the 1870s and 80s, they have a significant subsistence in clothing. Now, they buy a lot of fabric from the local store, and increasingly, if you're familiar with the history of the Industrial Revolution and the Textile Revolution, the 1820s and 30s, things really start to change in the United States. People start buying more manufactured cloth. But in the South, again, an unfortunate common theme is the last to adopt a lot of these more sophisticated things like manufactured cloth. So Aunt Eliza was good at still running a spinning wheel and using a loom. And they raised just a few bales of cotton. One bale of cotton would do, a bale of cotton is 500 pounds, right? So one bale of cotton would do a family of 3 or 4. If you raised a few sheep, that also you could mix it together and make a variety of fabrics out of it. But if you have 3 or 4, you don't need 4. You probably only need 1, so you sell the 3. Now, nobody gets rich selling 3 bales of cotton, but again, as you'll see, you don't need a lot of money necessarily, so they only have a minimal amount of things they need to buy with relation to clothing. The other thing, too, is that Wolfe's Uncle Swan is surprisingly devoid of a need for cash. Now, again, it's not a true barter economy. There's a lot of research in earlier colonial America about barter-type economies where there's very little cash or minimal cash, and people trade, all kinds of things. It's not necessarily a barter economy, but it has a very, very minimal need for cash. I think in one particular part of the book, Swan says that, Wolfe said that Uncle Swan probably only needed $40 or $50 of cash to get through the year. That's all he needed. Now, again, $1 a day is about the average laboring man's labor, right, during that time period. So you can sort of figure you need $300 and $350 a year if you're just going to live off of your own cash that you make. But if you only need $40 or $50 a year, that's to buy the coffee, the sugar, the salt, and so on and so forth. The rest, you don't actually have to have. Of course, that's the if, right? The big if is that if you own land. If you don't own land, then guess what? Everybody knows what that is. Then you're a sharecropper, you're a tenant farmer, you're in debt to a variety of sources. But here you don't own, you have land. The land is generally paid for. You have a small mortgage or no mortgage. Property taxes are super low, right? Thanks to Arkansas planters, land taxes were incredibly low because they didn't want to pay for anything. So land taxes were always low, so there wasn't a lot of extra cost otherwise. This is a huge surprise to people who have never encountered this. Some of you in this room may be very familiar with this, but in the 19th century, you did not have to fence your animals. Animals moved about where they wished. You had to fence in your crops. Now, it is the exact opposite from today. Today, you're driving down the highway in Arkansas, you see cattle, they are fenced in. You see a field of rice, it is not fenced in because the cattle are fenced in, right? It was just the opposite for hundreds of years of human history, maybe thousands of years of human history. You fenced in your crops and you kept the animals out, and otherwise they went where they would. So the Swan family didn't need to have a lot of land. You could actually let your animals roam around, even on other people's land. It was their responsibility to keep their, crops fenced in. That was theirs. Of course, if your hog kept getting into somebody else's corn patch, that did cause trouble, and eventually they might have extra bacon in their smokehouse, if you follow what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, that could cause problems sometimes. But it means you don't need to own land, right, to be able to have animals. Today, if you have animals, first you have to own the land. So back then, it was the opposite. So closing in the open range happens really in the early 20th century and later. That's a big, big difference that you see a lot in life in the leatherwoods. This also, too, is a huge difference. I mean, this really, as much as anything, sort of spells one of the key ingredients that sort of spells the end of family farming and this type of farming in Arkansas, and that is there's still very little infrastructure, and by that I mean transportation infrastructure in Arkansas, especially in the Ozarks, right, until the 1880s and the 1890s. It's really the 1890s before the state of Arkansas sort of has its basic framework of infrastructure of railroads. But see, before then, if a farmer in Calico Rock, Arkansas, grew a crop of wheat, why would he care what the price of wheat is in St. Paul, Minnesota? He wouldn't care at all, because there's no way wheat from St. Paul, Minnesota is going to get to him or vice versa. But then once General Mills opens up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they start buying wheat from everywhere, then all of a sudden, a farmer in Arkansas has to be concerned with the price of wheat in St. Paul and in California and in Little Rock and in other places, because the markets become so interconnected. But Uncle Swan doesn't have to deal with this as much. He can sort of live in his kind of modest isolation as he chooses, if you will. I think there's three unique features in the Swan family farm, and I have to be quick on these because I need to save the rest of the time to talk about the other example. But here's the three unique features. The first one is that there was no debt for the Swan family farm at a time in the 1870s and 80s where there's a significant rise in indebtedness of Arkansas farmers. A lot of this, frankly, is just the relic of the Civil War as much as anything. And the disruption of the crop cycles in 66, 67, through that time period, the first two crop cycles after the Civil War were particularly bad in Arkansas. The Civil War was the liquidation of the most valuable agricultural asset, which was human beings. And this created a huge crisis of bankruptcy for planters who had funds in those human beings but now had nothing to replace it with. So there's growing indebtedness in Arkansas farming during this time period, but not for the Swan family, and growing agricultural protests. Groups in Arkansas like the Agricultural Wheel, various other populist groups, in the Midwest and in the South particular, are really starting to protest. The Tenant Farmers Union that we spoke of earlier is the outgrowth of that in the next century, right, if you will. They're all connected. But Uncle Swan has no debt. So Uncle Swan is able to plant a wide variety of things. See, if he was a sharecropper, the bank or whoever holds his note would not give him any freedom to plant anything except one thing. Right, the one thing would be cotton. That's all he could plant, no matter what. And so now, because he doesn't have that debt, he does plant a variety of things. So he's not going to get rich, but he's probably not going to lose his farm either. But again, you can see all the intricacies. He doesn't have to compete with wheat farmers from California, and so on and so forth, all these kinds of things, because these things have not yet arrived, right, if you will. So he could, plant them and consume them, right? I mean, that's the other thing today. You see a wheat or a rice farmer today that has 500 acres of rice, they still go to Walmart to buy rice. See, that's totally counterintuitive to people in the 19th century. Why would you raise rice and then go to the store to buy rice? But see, today, the rice farmers are farming for cash. They're not farming because they love the taste of rice. They're farming for the cash, right, if you will. So that's the substantive difference. So he was not bound by a sharecropping contract, right, as I just said. So he could plant other things. That does give him a degree of freedom that doesn't exist for other farmers. And so it's noticeable. And I think what I'm really building up to is whenever I teach this to my students, I always try to make sure they understand how unique the narrative is, because increasingly the people around them are in different circumstances with fewer choices, right, than the Swan family has. The laborers, the interesting thing about the Swans is that they had no children. They had no biological children. So how in the world, you got to have labor on a 19th century farm, so how did they get it? They adopted informally, like John Wolfe and his sister, and they also adopted a lot of other orphans in the community. And by Wolfe's own recollection, they raised or partially raised some 13 children. Now, again, a lot of them were related to them, like Wolfe and his sister, but some of them were not. There was another boy who lived in the cabin at the same time as Wolfe, who was not blood kin at all, but Wolfe considered him like a brother, if you will, even though he was just a boy from the community that had no family and the Swans raised him. But they get the benefit of that labor, right? Those people, John Quincy Wolfe loves to eat biscuits, but he was out there in the field making the wheat, right? So he was working to make the biscuits and to eat the biscuits. But that's how they got their labor. And then lastly is the Swan family, I think, too, I'm always struck when I read the narrative of how much additional literacy they seem to have above and beyond. Now, it is a stereotype, a very negative stereotype, that 19th century Southerners were just entirely illiterate. Illiteracy was much higher in the 19th century than today, but it's not as rampant as you might be led to believe, maybe in film, for instance, and in other things. But nevertheless, the Swan family had what I would describe as an advanced literacy, and by this I mean particularly Uncle Swan subscribed to agricultural journals. There were several lying around in the log cabin. It's a little unusual for a farmer of that stature to spend money on that. Farmers back then were very famous for saying, you can't learn how to farm out of a book, right? You don't learn, that's book farming, right? Book farming is kind of in the future. That was really suspicious. You learn by the way Pa taught you how to farm. You learn farming by farming, not by reading about farming. But Swan was interested in new agricultural techniques which were being published. And apparently they did send all these adopted children to get a pretty good education. Even John Wolfe and his sister spent a couple of terms in Mountain Home, where they went away to school, to an academy for a couple of terms. And so that does represent, an extra investment in education. So it was important to the Swan family. And maybe I can come back during the Q&A and talk more about them if you want to. I think the Swans are very interesting because the book is funny, and at the same time it gives you a perfect sort of understanding of what common farming life was. Not too much, not too little, sort of that just right kind of range. Now, vastly different is a person named Reuben Blackwell. Now, Reuben Blackwell, again, I have no representative photographs of Reuben or of his mistress, the woman who owned him, Amanda Trulock. These are representative images. But I discovered Reuben Blackwell through the book Arkansas Women that Sharice Jones Branch and I, who's a dean here on campus now, edited together. And Mike Dugan, I see here, was one of the authors that we had a book on Arkansas women. And I ended up writing a chapter about Amanda Trulock. Now, to understand Reuben Blackwell, I got to give you sort of a 2-minute overview on Amanda Trulock, because that's how we know of this man named Reuben Blackwell. Amanda Trulock, who was the subject of one of my chapters in the book, Arkansas Women, was born and raised in Connecticut around 1810. She was 26 years old, never been married before, met a Georgia planter, a bachelor, who was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, visiting, and he courted her. He asked her to marry him. She said yes, and she moved to South Georgia. Now, she's 26, never been to the South before, and she becomes the plantation mistress of some 40 slaves and the wife of this planter. She wrote and that have survived probably 175 letters written from 1837 to around 1866. They trace her life in Georgia and then her life in 1845 when they moved to Pine Bluff, to a plantation right on the banks of the Arkansas River, about 8 miles downstream from the town of Pine Bluff. And that's mostly what we know from Amanda, especially the letters that she wrote while she was at Pine Bluff. Now, otherwise, we wouldn't know anything about Reuben. What we know about Reuben is that Reuben was a slave that the family owned and was already there when she arrived there. So what do we know about Reuben Blackwell through Amanda's writings? Well, I mean, Reuben Blackwell was probably born in 1820 in Virginia. Family records suggest that he was purchased as a teenager in the 1830s and was brought to South Georgia, and James Trulock, the bachelor planter, had purchased him at that time. So when Amanda Trulock comes to encounter him, he's already been a slave and has presumably been pulled away from his home in Virginia for several years. Now, let me move forward, and I'll tell you more about Reuben as we go along that'll flesh out more to the story of he and the woman who had legal ownership of him. Reuben is very, very unique, and in fact, I don't actually know how to describe Reuben. I don't know if there's an actual adjective to describe what his role was. I put in the title Black Overseer, but that is not really a term that is ever used. But we're sort of at a loss to scramble for what the term should be. Was Reuben a black overseer? Was he something else? His nobody ever calls him a black overseer. The term black overseer doesn't exist. Whenever somebody says, you know, we're going to talk about overseers in the Old South, most people get an image of a white man with a whip and that's generally true, and that's generally the way it was. Nobody gets an image of a black man serving as an overseer. But I want to be very specific here. Nobody in the Old South ever leaves any record in any letters or anywhere where they refer to a person of color as the overseer. Now, you might be aware, many times they do refer to the top hand in the slave quarters as a driver or the slave driver. And that is exactly the term that is often used, someone who drives the routine of work in the fields and tries to keep order in the slave quarters. Now, the term driver does come up. The problem is Reuben doesn't really fit the term driver either, because as you'll see, he does way more than that. So it's difficult to really give him a true title. That's what makes him so unique, and that's why I think he's so interesting to study. I interpret Reuben as being a co-manager. Now, to call him a co-manager is pretty bold, really, to call an enslaved human being who's 40 or 50 years old in 1850 the co-manager. But I don't know that there's much else that you can say that would make him to be anything else. And here, the reason is this. In 1849, Amanda Trulock becomes a widow. James dies suddenly, unexpectedly. And now here she is. At this point, she has 5 children. She has a lot of debt because James bought a bunch of land when they moved to Pine Bluff area, more than he could probably afford. And now she was a widow. She's a woman with no property rights. She has no citizenship status. She can't vote. She depends on other members of the family to help her. Her family in Connecticut, remember the Connecticut people don't really know anything about the South at all, or slavery from personal experience. And they're like, you should just sell out. You're a widow. Come back to Connecticut. That was the most logical thing to do. And in fact, most people in that situation probably would have done that, but she doesn't do it. For a year, she tries to run the plantation with the brother-in-law. The brother-in-law has to go on a move after the year is over, and then she turns to Reuben. Now, the reason we know she turns to Reuben is that in 1864, Reuben gave his story to a member of the Freedmen's Bureau, an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau, and we have that in the Freedmen's Bureau records. And so we have the Freedmen's Bureau's agent view of things, and he said that Amanda basically pleaded with Reuben, according to the Freedmen's Bureau record, and said, I've got nobody else. We're in debt. I need you to help me run the place. And so according to that interview, she seemed to entrust him with more than just being the slave driver. She seems to entrust him with the management of really everything. And as you'll see, he does seem to know just about everything about the way things are supposed to run. So I've referred to him as a co-manager. He runs the farm, Amanda runs the social schedule, and keeps the record books, but he runs the farm, right, exclusively. From 1851 to 1861, if you look at the letters, there's not a single agricultural decision that is made that comes through Amanda. They all start with Reuben. Amanda, in her letters to her family back in Connecticut, she just says things like, Reuben is determined to plant more corn this year, and so we did. Reuben is determined to plant X number of bales, or X number of acres of cotton, and so we did. Reuben is determined to have a gin house. Now we have a gin house. Reuben didn't like the first location of the gin house, so Reuben moved it. She approves every single decision, right, that he makes agriculturally, and so he's really in charge of all of them, and he's very prolific. I mean, he's really pushing the boundary. It seems the amount of acreage goes up from 350 acres of farmable land to 500 acres of farmable land. He clears new cropland every single year, right? She says that. He's trying to expand the amount of farmable acreage on the land in every respect, and he has all these plans for the future. How does he do this? See, that's the thing. He gets incredible productivity, and we don't know for sure. We can look at the records and see, indeed, he did eventually go from 150 bales of cotton in 1850 to 450 bales of cotton right on the same plantation. But of course, he increased the tillable acreage by like 40%, right, during that time period. So he has prolific productivity. That we don't know for sure. The most likely scenario, plausible hypothesis, is that he seems to start the working day a lot earlier. Now, this is hard to factor in because if you start the working day too early, you can't see. But you can do some work by lantern. There is a certain amount of work that can be done by lantern, not all of it. But he seems to start the workday quite early. We know this because the neighboring planters could hear him ringing the bell right across the delta, and they could say, Reuben has got the workers on the Trulock plantation up, right, and they're up early. And so he seemed to squeeze out extra time. Most likely, by starting earlier, he incentivized faster work, and then people could take off later in the day. Now, again, a lot of people say, well, what's the big deal? How wouldn't that be the way it would work anyway? If you know anything about the way slavery generally worked, there's no such thing as taking off early, right? Slaves work, they work in this field. If it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon and it's May, guess what? The sun is still up. You keep working till it gets dark. You just keep working. You work when the sun comes up. You work when the sun goes down. If you finish this field, you go to the next field. There's really no incentive to work faster, right, or slower. The incentive is just to maintain. So Reuben most likely, again, we don't know for sure, most likely got more productivity by incentivizing this type of labor. From July to October, he's the only person around with any authority. This is another thing that is truly fascinating. Amanda Trulock would say goodbye every, probably in the month of June, every year from 1851 to 1861. She'd take her children, her older children, and she would go back to Bridgeport, Connecticut, every single July. Now think about the last time you took a road trip, and now think about how would you get from Pine Bluff, Arkansas to Bridgeport, Connecticut before the railroads. It was 30 days one way in some instances, usually by boat, right? By steamboat up the Ohio River. Now you're starting to get a few railroads in Pennsylvania, and then she makes her way to Bridgeport, Connecticut. So she spent, 40 to 60 days in transit and a couple of months in Bridgeport. She did that every single summer for a decade. I haven't come across anybody in Antebellum, Arkansas who makes an annual trek like that, so that's truly unusual. But the key thing for Reuben was that he was alone from July to October, and the evidence suggests there's not any other white people on the plantation except her 2 youngest children. So she actually entrusts her 2 youngest children to him, and he's got full authority over them. There's even a fascinating incident there where one of the children was very sick, and Reuben telling the story to Amanda. Again, we get all this through Amanda, so we get one side of the story. But Amanda, Trulock tells us that Reuben tried to get the doctor. The doctor didn't come in time. The doctor finally came. The boy did recover. This was all while she was in Connecticut. And you can sort of hear Reuben trying to defend himself, that one of her children got sick. He was trying to take care of him. The doctor didn't come soon enough. The boy did recover, but if the doctor had come sooner, we wouldn't maybe have had the scare we had. What's interesting is that Amanda seems to believe Reuben's side of the story. She writes it in the letters to her sister, like, this is what Reuben said happened, and I believe it is true that the children did suffer. But they didn't suffer because of Reuben. They suffered because Reuben couldn't get the white doctor to come fast enough. But fortunately, that story ended okay. So it's an amazing amount of trust that she had. When she came back that first year from Connecticut, she said her 2-year-old didn't recognize her. He didn't know who she was. She'd been gone for 4 months. Then eventually, by 1857, Amanda goes up there, and there's no more white people on the plantation at all in the summertime. All the children are in Connecticut getting an education, and then she comes back, usually with a different female relative, to spend the winter. That makes good sense, too. I mean, Amanda's doing it right. Nobody wants to spend the summer in Arkansas. She goes to Connecticut. When it's cold in Connecticut, she comes back to Arkansas. And meanwhile, Reuben is just working hand over fist, trying to make as much money for her as possible, which he seems to do, right? So he's very attentive to that, has cakes and pies ready for her to go. The steamboat brings her right up to the plantation. When he hears the whistle, he and a couple of slaves are there waiting in the buggy to pick her up, right? They already know that she's there, and they come and pick her up after she's been gone for 4 months. Another surprise about Reuben, there's just surprise after surprise about Reuben Blackwell. Reuben Blackwell was literate. We have 6 letters, I think 4 that he wrote and 2 that another member of the Trulock family slaves also wrote. The transcribed copies of these are in the Jefferson County Historical Quarterly. If you care to look at them, that's what I saw. The originals might be in the local Jefferson County library, I'm not sure, but the transcribed copies are in the Jefferson County Historical Quarterly. So you can see what Reuben has to say. When you read the letters, Reuben is very much, you can tell, he's quite the diplomat. He's letting the family in Connecticut know. He's attending to everything as much as possible, and he's also trying to defend himself because sometimes planters next door, which is another problem, don't seem to like the fact, as you can kind of imagine, that Reuben seems to do so well, right? And sometimes he seems to do better than they do, which you can see could cause big problems to the whole system if you've got a black overseer, if you want to call him that, who seems to be producing more, bales to the hand than they seem to be producing, right? And so the farmers are always in kind of a competition, and this is a problem, and Reuben is writing about that. In fact, that's what I just mentioned. There seems to be a hint of some tension, especially with one neighbor in particular. I remember one sort of curious scenario where slaves from two plantations got together for a Sunday church service, and this white planter next door specifically called Reuben out and said, "Why don't you lead the prayer?" Knowing Reuben doesn't like to get up and speak in front of, 100 people. But he made him, and Reuben even told Amanda Trulock's brother, like, "I think he's making me pray on purpose for spite, because he knows it makes me uncomfortable, not for spiritual, right, reasons, but to put me on the spot, right, if you will." And so he's very much aware of this tension, and he's trying to defend himself to the family because, see, and this is really what I'm building up to. Reuben, this is my theory, my thesis. Reuben understands his situation. He is one heart attack away from being on the auction block. Amanda dies. The children are young. The family's in Connecticut. There's nobody else, right? So, I mean, he's really on a very, he doesn't even have an older son who's there on the plantation who will definitely take over there. They're all in Connecticut, and he's down here trying to make as much money as he can. And that seems to be his strategy, right, to implement that. And he understands how close he could be to a potential sale. Now, Reuben never says this, so this is inferred from the many, many letters and the in-between sort of things that you try to pull out of it. There is only one decision, and it is maybe the most fascinating incident really of all, I think, in the antebellum letters, where there is significant conflict between Reuben and Amanda. I mean, it goes on for several months, and Amanda is really worn out because Reuben over and over again keeps bringing this up. And see, when you look at this, it's the decision to buy more slaves. See, if without any explanation, as you read that bullet point, you go, oh, Amanda wants to buy more slaves, and Reuben doesn't. It is the opposite. Reuben wants to buy more slaves, and Amanda doesn't. And he keeps pressing her continually. It starts like in November, right after the 1856 harvest, and it continues well into the spring. And he's really fighting against the clock because he knows she's going to leave in June, and he knows how long it takes a letter to get back from Connecticut. He's writing to the family repeatedly, right? See, too, Reuben knows all these people. Amanda has a sister and a brother. Both of them have come down and spent a winter in Arkansas, so he knows them personally. They even mention him in letters and things, and he mentions them and inquires about them. So these aren't strangers. He doesn't know Amanda's father except through them, but he knows her only brother and her only sister personally, right, having lived with them, both for an entire winter in Arkansas. So how does this story resolve? It's truly fascinating. I think he knows so much about her finances that she writes, Reuben has asked me to give him everything he makes over $16,000 next year to purchase slaves. Now, in 1856, a field hand would maybe cost $1,000 to $1,500. $16,000 must be what Reuben knows he can make at least at the bare minimum with everything that they can sell. Extra corn, mostly cotton, which tells us so many things. Reuben knows the price of cotton in New Orleans. Reuben knows how much you have to pay cotton factors. Reuben knows how much the price of insurance is on cotton shipping. Reuben probably knows what the price of cotton is in Liverpool, right, which is the main cotton market in the world at the time. Reuben probably knows all of these things. He also knows the price of human beings, right? And he also knows how much Amanda Trulock has to make, right, to stay in the black, right, and not to go into the red. He knows all of these things. So he doesn't just say, let's buy more slaves. He makes her a business offer that has a real bottom line, $16,000, and I promise I'll make way above that. And if he only makes $18,000 or $19,000, he could purchase 3 or more, Amanda could purchase, at his request, 3 or 4 more, and then he could keep up, right? The reason this finally comes to light, I mean, he and Amanda go back and forth, and she finally, at some point he's on the verge of tears. She says, coming before her in the house while she's sitting there at her desk, and he's on the verge of tears, and she says, it's come to light eventually that a local planter was stirring up a rumor and said there's a credible rumor that another planter in the county wants to offer Amanda $100,000 for every body and every acre. So he said, so your Yankee mistress is just going to, sell you, and that's it. She's going back to Connecticut. She goes back there every summer anyway. Why should you want to stay around here? So Reuben felt it was a credible rumor, not just a rumor, but a credible rumor, not just county gossip, but something he felt was real. And see, the only way Reuben could make more money for her, other than being sold, was to work harder for her. And so the only way he could save himself was to see that he made her more money. And the only way he could make her more money, he thought, was to have more labor. So this is the thesis. We'll never know for sure. How it eventually got resolved was Amanda's father sent a letter that finally calmed things down. And it's very cryptic, but he said something about 100 years into the future, and it was a list of calculations, and that's what Amanda said. Now, then Amanda also said, I'm not used to making plans 100 years into the future, but this seemed to calm Reuben down considerably. That, to me, sounds cryptically like a long-term gradual emancipation plan, that they would want to institute a certain amount of cash flow, have it in reserve, and then at a certain point, gradually emancipate a generation, basically the way gradual emancipation worked at the state level, but do this on the plantation level, right, if you will. I can say some more during the Q&A as to why Amanda's family was so reluctant to engage in slave sale, but I'll have to let that stand because I need to finish the rest because I'm almost out of time. There's tension in 1861 when the Civil War starts. Amanda's oldest son now returns from Connecticut in 1861, right as the war is starting. Then the war starts. There's no traffic in or out of Pine Bluff. There's no letters for the next 2 years. And for the first time, there's a white male on the plantation. And maybe I'll just, bypass that for the Q&A, but that's tension. For the first time, there's a white adult male on the plantation. That's tension with Reuben because somebody else wants to have a say. Eventually, emancipation comes when the U.S. Army enters Pine Bluff in September 1863. Reuben, by his own admission in the interview with the Freedmen's Bureau, said he was the last one to leave. By that time, there were 62 slaves. And Reuben said he and his family were the last ones to leave. And according to the Freedmen's Bureau, they only left when the officers assured them that emancipation is genuinely true. President Lincoln has signed it, and it is genuine and real. And that is what your status is. And so only then did he finally come off the plantation. But Amanda was very embittered by that, as all planters were embittered by that. We could say some more about that, but that caused extreme bitterness and tension. The Trulocks continue to own this property well into the 20th century, and in fact, there may still be some there that own part of it today. I'm not positive. There's still members, descendants in the general Pine Bluff area and in Bridgeport, Connecticut, as well. And that's how we have the letters that we have. Family lore, according to their stories, says that Reuben had to go in 1863 because he was violent, because he hit a fellow slave in the head with a hoe. And that the brother, the oldest son of Amanda Trulock said that, that we can't have that, so he had to go. My thesis is that a story like that postbellum fits in with the general view that black people cannot be entrusted with responsibility. Therefore, their station is down here. Reuben got out of his station. That fits in more with the postbellum. It doesn't fit as well with the stuff we seem to think we know about Reuben from antebellum, right? If he was that violent, it doesn't fit with what we know about Amanda. She seems very reluctant to use violence, although we don't know for sure, but she seems very reluctant to use violence at all, and there's really no mention of it in her papers. So the thing is that, Reuben's plantation, management was a powerful rebuttal, right, in the antebellum period to the justification for slavery. Here's a quotation for you. This is Governor Henry Rector during the secession conventions that Arkansas had, of which we had two, and this is during the first one. And Governor Rector said, God in his omnipotent wisdom created three things: the cotton plant, the African Negro, and the lower Mississippi Valley. Right? And he created a gallant race of men and women produced upon its soil to defend and execute that decree. Reuben was not doing what he was supposed to do in this formula. He is supposed to be the one working the soil. And instead, he's executing the decree, and that is the white man's responsibility. So Reuben is really defying, with his plantation success, what the standards were. So, yeah, ultimately, he undermines the accepted racial order, I think, if you will. Let me just leave you with this one instead. I have one more, but I'll just leave you with this one. This is the last glimpse we have of Reuben in the documented records. This is where we know with 99% certainty that his name is Blackwell. He did not take the name Trulock. If you looked in the records for Reuben Trulock, would make a fair amount of sense. But since he was a teenager when he was sold from Virginia, Blackwell is the most likely surname of the family from Virginia. So it would make sense that he would use that surname. The way we know for sure this is the Reuben we're looking for is if you can look and you can see he has two daughters. Now this is this must be his second wife. We're not certain about that, but this must be his second wife and his second family. But you can see the name of one daughter, a daughter who would have been born in 1862. And if you look at it closely, you can see her name, Amanda. He named his daughter in 1862 Amanda. And then the other daughter, Victoria, that was Amanda's daughter, was named Victoria. So he named his daughters Amanda and Victoria after the mistress and the mistress's oldest female child. So again, it's a mixed record as to say what Reuben is thinking when he does something like that. Because I'm out of time, we can maybe talk about that during the Q&A. But I do thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Do you have a theory on how they were able to get around that if there was such a law in their area?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a state law. That's a great question. I actually looked that up during lunch because I know of some state laws, and Mike Dugan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Arkansas has a state law against slave literacy. About 5 or 6 southern states did. They'll have various types of penalties. Sometimes they just penalize the white person for trying to teach them. Sometimes they penalize, assemblies of black people for the purpose of learning literacy and so forth. And so the easiest answer to that question is it really comes back to Amanda Trulock's unique life background. She's a Connecticut Yankee, literally. Now, she's a Connecticut Yankee who courted a slave owner and knew that when she said yes to marrying him, she would be a slave mistress. So she embraces slavery eventually, but she also is a Connecticut Yankee. And so from her perspective, she sort of triangulates between, she polarizes between these two positions. And so from her point of view, literacy is not a problem. I mean, even Amanda's sister, Marcia, sends religious tracts to Reuben. And he writes back, thank you for the religious tracts. I mean, they're obviously, violating several laws in several states, but not in Connecticut or Arkansas, I guess, at the time. So, I mean, I guess it's the unique background of Amanda's experience with slavery. But she's still pro-slave. But it's complicated. But she's still pro-slave.
Yes, I wanted to ask, where did the Trulock, I know the oldest son came back here to Arkansas, but where did Amanda and her children situate themselves during the conflict in Connecticut or here or what?
Well, no, she can't. I mean, during the conflict, she can't leave Arkansas until 1863. So the oldest son is, traveled back with her in the summer of 61. Or in the spring of 61, he came back at some point. It's not clear, but he's there when the war starts. Then the war starts and he can't leave. What's really fascinating is that Amanda's not very political. She's practical. And also, too, she visits the North every summer and she lives in the South. You can't really go back and forth in America in the 1850s and say, God bless the South in Connecticut or God bless, the Federal Republic in Arkansas. You got to have a foot in both worlds. And so she's very diplomatic in that regard. But surprisingly, she wants her sons to serve in neither army. Neither army. And so she actually pays for a substitute for the son that lives with her outside of Pine Bluff. She pays $3,000 for a substitute, and he doesn't go. And later on, in 1864, when she starts writing letters again, she praises him for not going. She's like, no son could do more for a mother than my son has done for me, which is truly remarkable because all the women in her neighborhood have all given sons to the Confederate cause. Pretty much all of them have given at least one. So it's a pretty bold thing for her to say, no son could have done more for his mother. Other sons have left their mothers to get along as best they can. It was kind of like, most white Southerners would say, well, there's a war, don't you think they should? But that's not what Trulock thinks. And then when the second son comes back in 1864, and they swap places, the older son goes back to Connecticut, and so he never serves in either army. Then the second son gets conscripted by the Confederacy. So she has a strange sort of story, again, literally a foot in both worlds. And her daughter Victoria marries a Union captain. Right after the Civil War. So it's not unlike a lot of other stories, actually. Yeah.
I'm curious as to where Amanda died. Was she in Connecticut? Was she in Arkansas? Because her husband died in Arkansas, correct?
Correct.
So where would she be buried?
Right. She's buried in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where she grew up. In 1866, she goes back to Bridgeport to resume, presumably, her annual migrations to Bridgeport, Connecticut. But as far as we know, she never came back. Now, at that point, her children, her sons are grown, they're young adults, and they want to make their mark in the world. The war's over, they've got cotton land in the Delta. And see, again, they grew up in Bridgeport, but everything in Bridgeport was paid for by Reuben, making cotton back in Pine Bluff. So they all knew where the money came from. So they want to go back and now make their mark in the world. And so they do. And the family, the sons continue on. The three oldest divide up the land and try to do what they can. And actually start arguing a lot over the money. And that grieves Amanda. But she doesn't go back. I think to her, it's a very romantic notion. This is my theory, because she doesn't write any letters after 1866. But I think the South she knew is kind of like a Scarlett O'Hara. The South that she knew is gone with the wind, that's for sure. And she's very bitter about it, because she felt like she was a benevolent slave mistress, and that she had a good compromise. Which again, there's still even more to say about that, how she arrived at that. But she died in Bridgeport.
Found Reuben in the 1870 census. Do you know where he was and what he was, other than farm labor? What's his situation?
Yeah, that's it. It's in Union County, so we moved further south. So he's still in Arkansas. I'm sorry. There's one other thing. Again, because I spent so much time talking about other things. If you look at the census, those of you who looked at it, I forget which column it is, because when I copied it, it didn't save the headers. But the 1870 census asked if the person is literate or illiterate. Well, and this is purely up to the census taker unless he asked them directly. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. 1870 census says Reuben is illiterate. Now, most likely, I think most likely that is a wise strategy on Reuben's part in 1870. And in another county that he's not from, and some white census taker says, boy, can you read? And he'd be like, no, sir, I can't read. That's a smart strategy in 1870, right? But it's interesting when you look at it like that, because we know for a fact we have his own handwriting, in the archives, that he can write and read. So, but yeah, that's where he is. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a question about the swan.
Hmm.
Do you know how they came to get their land?
No, I don't. Wolf doesn't mention that specifically. He's writing as like remembering from age 11 to age 17. And so it's really a kind of a book of boyhood and coming of age and all the fun things he did on the farm and the hard work and Mark Twain-esque type of stories. So I could look in the agricultural census and try to see how many acres. I haven't done that for Swan yet. But I'm glad that you mentioned that question, because during your talk about permaculture, I thought that's exactly what the Swans are doing. They're just figuring out a way to make agriculture work year-round. It's totally sustainability. That's really what they have. And so, which is kind of the danger which would be romanticizing, I think, what the Swans did, and sort of the romanticizing of that in general. But I don't know how he came into that.
I asked because the shade that is near Batesville, this little small community of the shade, I know that started due to the shade family got a land grant after, I think, the War of 1812.
Oh, yeah.
And they got a whole section, and I was just sort of wondering if it was the same.
Yeah, no, he's born in Georgia. Swan was born in Georgia, was in Louisiana, and then came up to the Ozarks, and so. Yeah, most likely he had a little piece of land before and was able to use that cash to buy a piece of, Ozark farm property.
You can ask questions about the Edwards or any of our other presenters, Dr. Long and Yeoman.
For you, sir, again, I need your help deciphering the line on that extended to the census right there, beneath Harriet, where it says keeping house. Jane, what is that listed as her occupation?
Oh, this one?
Yes.
Oh, at home, I think. Yeah.
That looks like a very sloppy tea.
Yeah, it is. It's probably at home or on home. But this one seems to say keep house, so it's hard to know. It's very, anybody's ever worked with the census knows each census taker has their own unique way of doing it. You have to sort of know the census taker and figure out their alphabet, their handwriting. I mean, so that's my initial guess. Yeah. There's keeping houses above, I don't know. I could say one other thing, since in case nobody asked, and I don't want to dominate the time, but I could say one other thing about Amanda Trulock's family in Connecticut decided that she could never sell the slaves, ever. Now, this was before Reuben made his offer, but we know this from a variety of sources in the letters, and the reason was when her brother came down in 1850, when she became a widow. Her brother was a Congregationalist minister from Connecticut, so you can imagine his sensibilities with slavery in the Arkansas Delta in 1850. And he said it was violent. People beat slaves with sticks and with whips and with pieces of furniture. She said there are all kinds of mixed-race children in the neighborhoods, and nobody seems to know who the fathers are, but everybody does know who the fathers are, and on all these kinds of things. And eventually, the point of the story here is that her brother convinced her. He said, we would like it if you would come to Connecticut, but if you came to Connecticut, you have to sell all 50 at that time of these people, and you have to sell them to these neighbors. And I think as a New England Congregationalist minister, he was like, you would be sending them to a worse hell than the one they're in now. They're slaves now, but they're your slaves, right? If you sell them to your neighbors, I know exactly what they would be. And it was almost, for him, it was a matter of conscience. It would almost be like just, kicking somebody out of the lifeboat when you've got room for them in the lifeboat. And maybe they should be on the big ship, but at least they're on the lifeboat, right? You're not kicking them into the water. And so it was really a moral question for the family as to whether or not they could sell the slaves. And so that's why when Reuben says buy more, it was obvious that the Connecticut family was uncomfortable with owning slaves through Amanda. They were really uncomfortable with becoming slave traders through Amanda, which is like a step below owning slaves, which is to trade in slaves. And so that's eventually why she made that decision, I think. So.
Do you need to ask a question of any of our speakers today? Well,
was Reuben I know we don't have pictures of him per se or anything like that, but is there any evidence that suggests he was biracial or?
No way to suggest. I think she would have maybe said something, perhaps at some point, but there's no way to know that.